Hello, and welcome to StoryTime. Today, we will be reading A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. We are on Part 1, Chapter 4, entitled What John Rance Had to Tell. It was 1 o'clock when we left number 3 Lauritsen Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led me to the nearest telegraph office when he dispatched a long telegram. He then hailed a cab and ordered the driver to take us to the address given to us by Lestrade. "There's nothing like first-hand evidence," he remarked. "As a matter of fact, my mind is entirely made up upon the case, but we may still as well learn all that there is to be learned." "You amaze me, Holmes," I said. "Surely you are not as sure as you pretend to be of all those particulars you gave." "There's no room for mistake," he answered. "The very first thing which I observed on arriving was that a cab had made 2 ruts with its wheels close to the curb. Now, up until last night, we have had no rain for a week, so that those wheels which left such a deep impression must have been there during the night. There were marks of the horse's hooves, too, an outline of one which was far more clearly cut than that of the other 3, showing that has a new shoe. Since the cab was there after the rain began, and was not there any time during the morning, I have Gregson's word for that, it follows that it must have been there during the night, and therefore that it brought those 2 individuals to the house." "That seems simple enough," said I, "but how about the other man's height?" "Why, the height of a man, in 9 cases out of 10, can be told by the length of his stride. It is a simple calculation enough, though there is no use in my boring you with the figures. I had this fellow's stride both on the clay outside and on the dust within. Then, when I had ways of checking my calculation, when a man writes on a wall, his instinct leads him to write at a level about with his own eyes. Now, that writing was just over 6 feet from the ground. It was child's play." "And his age?" "Well, if a man can stride 4.5 feet without the smallest of effort, then he can't quite be in the sere and yellow. That was the breadth of the puddle on the garden walk, which he had evidently walked across. Patent leather boots had gone round, and square toes had hopped over. There is no mystery about it at all. I am simply applying to ordinary life a few of those precepts of observation and deduction which I advocated in that article. Is there anything else that puzzles you?" "The fingernails and the trichopoly," I suggested. "The writing on the wall was done with the man's forefinger dipped in blood. My glass allowed me to observe that the plaster was slightly scratched in doing it, which would not have been the case if the man's nail had been trimmed. I gathered up some scattered ash from the floor. It was dark in color and flaky. Such ash is only made by a trichopoly. I have made a special study of cigar ashes. In fact, I have written a monologue about the subject. I flatter myself that I can distinguish at a glance the ash of any known brand, either cigar or tobacco. It is just such the details that the skilled detective differs from the Gregson and the Lestrade type." "And the florid face?" I asked. That was a more daring shot, though I have no doubt that I was right. You must not ask me that at the present state of the affair." I passed my hand over my brow. "My head is in a whirl," I remarked. "The more one thinks of it, the more mysterious it grows. How came these 2 men, if there were 2 men, into an empty house? What has become of the cabman who drove them? How could one man compel another to take poison? Where did the blood come from? What is the object of the murderer, since robbery had no part in it? How came a woman's ring there? Above all, why should the second man write the German word Roche before decamping? I confess I cannot see any possible way of reconciling all these facts." My companion smiled approvingly. "You sum up the difficulties of the situation succinctly and well," he said. "There is still much that is still obscure, though I've quite made up my mind on the main facts. As to poor Lestrade's discovery, it was simply a blind intended to put the police upon the wrong track, by suggesting socialism and secret societies. It was not done by a German. The A, as you noted, was printed somewhat after the German fashion. Now, a real German invariably prints in the Latin character, so that we may safely say that this was not written by one, but by a clumsy imitator who overdid his part. It was simply a ruse to divert the inquiry into the wrong channel. I'm not going to tell you much more, Doctor. You know the conjurer gets no credit when once he has explained his trick, and I'll show you too much of my method working. You will come to the conclusion that I am a very ordinary individual after all." "I shall never do that," I answered. You have brought detection as near an exact science as it ever will be brought to in this world. My companion flushed up with pleasure at my words and the earnest way in which I uttered them. I had already observed that he was as sensitive to flattery on the score of his art as any girl could be to her beauty. I'll tell you one thing, he said. Patent Leathers and Square Toes came in the same cab, and they walked down the pathway together as friendly as possible, arm in arm in all probability. When they got inside, they walked up and down the room, or rather, Patent Leathers stood still while Square Toes walked up and down. I could read that all in the dust, and I could read that as he walked he grew more and more excited. That is shown by the increased length in his strides. He was talking all the while, and working himself up, no doubt into a fury. Then the tragedy occurred. I have told you all that I know myself, now, for the rest is mere surmise and conjecture. We have a good working basis, however, on which to start. We must hurry up, for I wish to go to Hale's concert and hear Norman Neruda this afternoon. This conversation had occurred while our cab had been threading its way through a long succession of dingy streets and dreary byways. The dingiest and dreariest of them, our driver suddenly came to a stand. That's Audley Court right there, he said, pointing to a narrow slit in a line of dead-colored brick. You'll find me here when you come back. Audley Court was not an attractive locality. The narrow passage which led us into a quadrangle paved with flags and lined with sordid dwellings. We picked our way amongst groups of dirty children and through lines of discolored linen till we came to number 46, the door of which had been decorated with a small slip of brass with the name of Rance engraved. On inquiry, we found that the constable was in bed, and we were shown into a little parlour to await his coming. He appeared presently, looking a little irritable at being disturbed in his slumbers. "Made my report at the office," he said. Holmes took a half-sovereign from his pocket and played with it pensively. "We thought we should like to hear it all from your own lips," he said. "I should be most happy to tell you anything I can," the constable answered with his eyes upon the glittering little golden disc. "Just let us hear it all in your own way as it occurred." Rance sat down on the horsehair sofa and knitted his brows as though determined not to admit anything in his narrative. "I'll tell ye from the beginning," he said. "My time is from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. At 11 there was a fight at the White Hart, but the bar was all quiet enough on the beat. At 1 o'clock it began to rain, and I met Harry Murcher, him who have the Holland Grove beat, and we stood together at the corner of Henrietta Street a-talkin'. Presently, maybe about 2 or a little after, I thought I would take a look round and see what was all right down Brixton Road. It was precious dirty and lonely. Not a soul did I meet all the way down, though a cab or two went past me. I was strolling down, thinking between ourselves how uncommon a handy a forgin hot would be, when suddenly the glint of a light caught my eye in the window of that same house. Now, I knew them 2 houses in Lauritsen Gardens were empty on account of that who owns them won't have the drains seen to, though the very last tenant what lived there died of typhoid fever. I was knocked up in a heat, therefore, at seeing a light in the window, and I suspected something was wrong. When I got to the door, you stopped and then walked back to the garden gate," my companion interrupted. "What did you do that for?" Rance gave a violent jump and started at Sherlock Holmes, with the utmost amazement upon his feature. "Why, that's true, sir," he said, "though how you come by it, heaven only knows. You see, when I got up to the door, it was so still and so lonesome, that I thought I'd be none for worse if someone with me. I ain't afeard of nothing on this side of the grave, but I thought that maybe it was him who died of typhoid inspecting the drains what killed him. The thought gave me a kind of turn, and I walked back to the gate to see if I could see Murcher's lantern, but there was no sign of him nor of anyone else." "There was no one in the street?" "Not a living soul, sir, nor so much as a dog. Then I pulled myself together and went back and pushed the door open. All was quiet inside, so I went into the room where the light was a-burning. There was a candle a-flickering on the mantelpiece, a red one, and by its light I saw— Yes, I know all of what you saw. You walked round the room several times, and you knelt down by the body, and then you walked through and tried the kitchen door. And then— John Rance sprang to his feet with a frightened face and suspicion in his eyes. "Where was you hid to see all that?" he cried. "Seems to me that you know a good deal more than you should." Holmes laughed and threw his card across the table at the constable. "Don't get arresting me for the murder," he said. "I'm one of the hounds and not the wolf. Mr. Gregson or Mr. Lestrade will answer for that. Go on, though. What did you do next?" Rance resumed his seat, without, however, losing his mystified expressions. I went back to the gate and I sounded my whistle. That brought Murcher and 2 more to the spot. Was the street empty then? Well, it was, as far as anyone who could be of any good goes. What do you mean? The constable's features broadened into a grin. I've seen many a drunk chap in my time, he said, but never one so cryin' drunk as that cove. He was at the gate when I came out, a-leanin' up against the railin', a-singin' at the pitch of his lungs about Columbine's newfangled banner or some such. He couldn't stand far less help. What sort of a man was he? Asked Sherlock Holmes. John Rance appeared to be somewhat irritated at this digression. He was an uncommon sort of man, he said. He'd have found himself at the station if we hadn't been so took up. His face, his dress, didn't you notice them? Sherlock Holmes broke in impatiently. I think I did notice them, seeing as I had to prop him up. Me and Murcher between us. He was a long chap with a red face, the lower part muffled round. That will do, cried Holmes. What became of him? We'd enough to do without looking after him, the policeman said in an aggravated voice. I'd wager he found his way home all right. How was he dressed? A brown overcoat. Had he a whip in his hand? A whip? No. He must have left it behind, muttered my companion. You didn't happen to see or hear a cab after that? No. Here's a half-sovereign to you, my companion said, standing up and taking his hat. I'm afraid, Rance, that you will never rise in the force. That head of yours should be for use as well as an ornament. You might have gained your sergeant's stripes last night. The man whom you held in your hands is the man who holds the clue to this whole mystery and of whom we are seeking. There is no use arguing about it now. I'll tell you that it is so. Come along, Doctor. We started off for the cab together, leaving our informant incredulous, but obviously uncomfortable. That blundering fool, Holmes said bitterly as we drove back to our lodgings. Just to think of his having such incurable bit of luck and not taking advantage of it. I am rather in the dark still. It is true that the description of this man tallies with your idea of the second party in this mystery. But why should he come back to the house after leaving it? That is not the way of criminals. The ring, man, the ring. That is what he came back for. If we have no other way of catching him, we can always bait our line with the ring. I shall have him, Doctor. I shall lay you 2 to 1 that I have him. I must thank you for it all. I might not have gone but for you, and so have missed the finest study I've ever come across. A study in Scarlet, eh? Why shouldn't we use a little art jargon? There's a scarlet thread of murder running through this colorless skein of life, and it's our duty to unravel it, and isolate it, and expose every inch of it. And now for lunch, and then for Norman Neruda. Her attack and bowing are splendid. What's that little thing of Chopin's she plays so magnificently? Tra-la-la-la-la-lay-lay. Leaning back in the cab, this amateur bloodhound caroled away like a little lark, while I meditated upon the many-sidedness of the human mind. And that concludes Chapter 4 of A Study in Scarlet. We hope that you will join us again shortly for Chapter 5. Goodbye.